The suitcase handle was slick with rain when Derek set it down on the porch and said the words that would end our relationship as father and son for the next 11 months. "Dad, you and Mom need to make room. This is Tyler's house now. He's got a family to raise." My wife Evelyn was still holding the folded quilt from our bed, the one her mother had stitched 40 years ago, and she was shaking, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from the effort of standing upright after the treatment she'd had 3 days earlier. I remember looking past my son's shoulder into the living room where I had taught him to ride a bicycle, in that very hallway where we'd hung his kindergarten drawings on the refrigerator, where I had sat up all night the year he had pneumonia, and I remember thinking that a house can hold 40 years of love and still be handed away like it was a coupon that expired. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I picked up Evelyn's medicine bag, took my wife's arm, and walked down the steps into the rain. And if my son had looked closely enough, if he had known what I knew, he would have understood that he had just made the worst financial and personal decision of his life. But he didn't know. Nobody ever does until the paperwork catches up with them. To understand how a 68-year-old man and his wife ended up standing in the rain outside the house he built with his own hands, you have to go back 3 years, to the spring Evelyn was diagnosed. It started small, the way these things do. Fatigue she blamed on gardening. A shortness of breath she blamed on the humidity. Then came the cardiologist, the words congestive, monitor, reduce stress, and the quiet, terrifying arithmetic that comes with any serious diagnosis. How much time? How much money? How much of ourselves we would have left when it was over. I had spent 31 years as an accountant for mid-sized manufacturing firms, the kind of unglamorous work that never makes anyone rich but makes them careful. And being careful is exactly what let us afford the treatments without touching our retirement. What it could not buy was peace in our own home, because that was the same spring our son Derek came to us with a plan. Derek was 34 then, married to a woman named Vanessa, whose father, Roland Ashford, ran a boutique real estate development firm that flipped modest homes into luxury rentals across 3 counties. Derek had never worked for Roland directly, but he orbited that world. He did marketing for a property management company Roland had connections to, and he had absorbed Roland's way of talking about houses, which was to say he had stopped thinking of our house as a home and started thinking of it as an asset with an inefficient use case. He came to us at Sunday dinner with a proposal dressed up as concern. "You two shouldn't be handling stairs and a big yard with Mom's heart the way it is," he said. "Vanessa and I have been looking at options. What if we all lived together? You could downsize your worries, we could downsize our mortgage, and the baby, when it comes, would have grandparents right there." Evelyn cried at the table, moved that our son wanted us close during what she rightly suspected might be her hardest years. I was more cautious, the way accountants tend to be, but I loved my son, and I told myself that caution should not be mistaken for wisdom when your wife's heart is failing, and your son is offering you closeness instead of distance. What we agreed to, on paper and in the informal way families agree to things, over dinner with handshakes instead of contracts, was this. Derek and Vanessa would sell their small condo and move into our house, which had 4 bedrooms and was fully paid off, and they would take over the property taxes and utility costs, while Evelyn and I would keep the deed in our name and use the money we saved to fund her treatment. It seemed at the time like the kind of arrangement that responsible families make, a blending of resources for a common good. Roland Ashford, when he heard about it at a barbecue that summer, smiled in a way I did not understand then but understand perfectly now, and said, "Smart. Keep it in the family. Just make sure everything's documented properly. You don't want any confusion later." I remember thinking he was giving me good advice. I did not yet understand that he was measuring the walls. The first 18 months were, if not entirely peaceful, at least tolerable. Vanessa redecorated rooms without asking, which stung more than I let on, but I told myself a house is meant to be lived in, not preserved like a museum. Derek grew more distant during that time, working long hours, coming home irritated, and Vanessa began speaking to Evelyn in the clipped, instructional tone people use with children rather than with the woman who had raised the man she married. Small things. A comment about how Evelyn shouldn't really be in the kitchen so much, given her heart. A suggestion that I let the professionals handle simple home repairs I had done myself for 4 decades. I noticed these things accumulating the way I used to notice discrepancies in a company's ledger, small, individually explainable, but forming a pattern that told a larger story if you had the patience to keep the receipts. And I did keep the receipts. This is the part of myself I am least apologetic about and most grateful for. 31 years of accounting does something to a man's instincts. I did not keep records because I suspected betrayal. I kept records because it is simply how I move through the world. Every dollar Derek and Vanessa contributed toward taxes and utilities, I logged. Every text message about the arrangement, I saved. When Vanessa asked me, 6 months in, to just sign this quick form for the property tax exemption paperwork, I read it before I signed anything, the way I have read every document placed in front of me since 1987, and I noticed it was not a tax exemption form at all, but a joint ownership disclosure that would have added Derek's name to the deed. I did not accuse anyone. I simply said I wanted our lawyer, a longtime friend named Marcus Hale, to review it first, and the form quietly disappeared from conversation, the way things do when someone realizes they've been seen. Vanessa became pregnant that winter, and the household's temperature changed overnight. Suddenly, the house that had 4 bedrooms had, in Derek's words, not enough room for a nursery, a guest space, and mom and dad. Suddenly, Evelyn's medical equipment, an oxygen concentrator, a stack of medication organizers, a shower chair, became, in Vanessa's words, clutter that makes the house feel like a hospital instead of a home for a baby. I want to be honest here, because honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I do not believe Derek set out, from the very beginning, to betray us. I believe he was a man being slowly reshaped by the people around him, the way water reshapes stone, not through violence, but through years of pressure applied, so gradually you don't notice the stone has changed until you compare it to a photograph from before. Roland Ashford visited Moore that spring, always with some comment about generational wealth transfer and getting your parents' estate planning squared away early, for everyone's benefit. I began to understand, with the cold clarity that comes to a man who has spent his life reading balance sheets, that Roland was not offering family advice. He was coaching his son-in-law toward an asset. The baby, Tyler, was born in April, and I will say without irony that holding my grandson for the first time was one of the purest joys of my life, undiminished by anything that came after. But joy, in that house, had become a currency that Vanessa and her father seemed determined to spend against us. Within 3 weeks of Tyler's birth, Vanessa told Evelyn, gently at first, that the noise of Evelyn's oxygen machine at night was disrupting the baby's sleep schedule, even though the nursery was on the opposite end of the house. Within 6 weeks, Derek suggested, almost apologetically, that maybe Evelyn and I should think about assisted living, just so you're not managing stairs, and so the house can really work for Tyler. I asked him directly, for the first time in 3 years, whether this was his idea or Roland's. He did not answer. That silence told me everything the words never would. I want to pause here and tell you what I did during those weeks, because it is the part of this story I am proudest of, and it is not dramatic in the way people expect revenge stories to be dramatic. I did not confront anyone, I did not raise my voice. I drove alone to Marcus Hale's office and asked him to pull every document related to our house, the deed, the tax records, our will, and the informal cost-sharing agreement Derek and I had shaken hands on 3 years earlier. Marcus, who had handled Evelyn's and my estate planning for over a decade, looked through the folder and asked me a question that changed the entire trajectory of what came next. Harold, did you ever formally transfer any ownership interest to Derek? Any quitclaim, any trust amendment, anything at all? I told him no, that the deed had remained in my name, and Evelyn's name the entire time, exactly as it had been since we bought the house in 1994. Marcus leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Then legally, Harold, it doesn't matter what anyone in that house thinks they're entitled to. You own it, outright. No mortgage, no liens, no joint title. If your son and his wife asked you to leave that house, they would be asking the actual owner to vacate his own property." I had known this in the abstract, the way you know a fact without feeling its weight. In that office, for the first time, I felt the weight of it. I did something else that spring that I have never told anyone outside of this story. I quietly requested copies of every bank transfer Derek and Vanessa claimed to have made toward property taxes and utilities over the previous 3 years. It took 2 weeks and several uncomfortable phone calls to our county assessor and utility providers, but I confirmed what my instincts had already told me. Of the roughly $41,000 Derek had verbally promised to contribute annually, Actual verified contributions totaled just under $14,000 across the entire 3 years. The rest, according to Derek's own comments at dinner over time, had gone toward getting Vanessa's business off the ground. A boutique staging company that, as it happened, exclusively used properties connected to Roland Ashford's development firm. My son had not been sharing a home with his aging parents to support them. He had been living in our house nearly rent-free while funneling his own money into his father-in-law's business empire, all while positioning us quietly to be the ones who eventually left. Evelyn's health took a difficult turn that June, a hospitalization that lasted 5 days and left her weaker than I had ever seen her. And I remember sitting beside her hospital bed, thinking that whatever else happened, I needed our final years to be lived somewhere that felt like ours, not somewhere we were tolerated. When we came home from the hospital, exhausted and frightened, we found that Vanessa had already moved Evelyn's medical equipment into the garage to make room, and had converted what had been Evelyn's reading room, the one space in the house that was entirely hers, into a home office for her staging business. Evelyn did not cry in front of them. She cried later, in our bedroom, quietly enough that she thought I couldn't hear. And that was the night I decided that patience, while a virtue, is not the same thing as passivity, and that I would no longer simply document what was happening. I would prepare for what was coming. I called Marcus Hale again and asked him to draft 2 things: a formal, dated letter establishing the terms of Derek and Vanessa's residency in our home as a revocable, at-will arrangement with no ownership implications whatsoever, to be signed and witnessed, and a full update to our estate plan that restructured how the house and our savings would eventually pass to Derek. Not removing him, because I did not want revenge in the sense of punishment for its own sake, but restructuring the inheritance into a trust with conditions, administered by Marcus as trustee, that would only release the house to Derek upon verification that he and Evelyn's care needs had been met with dignity during our lifetimes. I did not tell Derek any of this. I simply asked him, one evening, to sign the residency letter, framing it as something Marcus recommended for tax purposes, which was not exactly a lie, since Marcus genuinely had recommended it, just not for the reason I implied. Derek signed it without reading it closely, the same casual carelessness that had led him believe, all along, that possession of a house is the same thing as ownership of it. The eviction, when it came, arrived exactly the way these things tend to when someone has convinced themselves they are the reasonable party. It was a Tuesday in September. Derek called a family meeting, which is to say he sat Evelyn and me down in what used to be our own living room and told us, with Vanessa standing behind him and Roland Ashford, uninvited, sitting in an armchair that had belonged to my late father, that the situation with the house needed to change. He explained in the calm, rehearsed tone of a man repeating someone else's talking points, that Tyler was growing, that Vanessa's business needed the office space permanently, that Evelyn's medical equipment created an unsafe environment for a toddler, and that he had found us a lovely senior community 20 minutes away that he had already put a deposit on. He said the words that became the hook of this very story. "Dad, you and Mom need to make room. This is Tyler's house now. He's got a family to raise." I asked him calmly whether he understood that the house was not legally his or Tyler's or anyone's but Evelyn's and mine. Roland Ashford answered before Derek could, saying smoothly that possession matters more than paperwork in situations like this, Harold, and frankly, at your age, a fight isn't worth the stress on your wife's heart. It was, I realized later, the only threat he ever needed to make plainly, that our own frailty could be used as leverage against us. I did not fight that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think the temptation in stories like this is to have the wronged party deliver a thunderous speech in the moment of confrontation, and that is not how real dignity works. Real dignity, I have learned, often looks like silence in the moment and precision afterward. I took Evelyn's arm, we packed 2 suitcases, and we left for an extended stay hotel that night, the same hotel where, 3 days later, in the rain, on what should have been a temporary visit back to collect the rest of our belongings, my son stood on the porch of my own house and told me to make room, as if I were the guest and he were the host. We stayed in that hotel for 6 weeks. I want to tell you what those 6 weeks were not. They were not weeks of despair, and they were not weeks of plotting cruelty. They were weeks of methodical, unhurried preparation, conducted with the same calm I once brought to closing a company's books at the end of a difficult fiscal year. Marcus Hale filed on my behalf a formal notice to vacate, giving Derek and Vanessa the legally required 30 days to leave the property that was, and had always been, in Evelyn's and my name alone. I did not do this out of spite. I did it because Marcus explained, patiently, that without the formal notice, any future legal proceeding would be muddied by Derek's claim that he had believed, in good faith, that the house was informally his. I made sure there could be no good faith confusion. I sent, by certified mail, copies of the deed, the residency letter Derek had signed months earlier without reading, and a formal statement of the actual financial contributions he had made over 3 years, verified against county and utility records. I was not trying to humiliate my son. I was trying to make the truth undeniable because I had learned, over 3 years in that house, that ambiguity was the only weapon Roland Ashford's family knew how to wield, and the only antidote to ambiguity is documentation. The response came faster than I expected, not from Derek, but from Roland Ashford, who called Marcus's office directly, attempting to negotiate what he called a reasonable transition period and, more tellingly, offering to purchase the house at fair market value on Derek's behalf to resolve this amicably. I understood, reading Marcus's summary of that call, exactly what Roland had been building toward for 3 years, not a family living arrangement, but a slow-motion acquisition, using his own son-in-law as the vehicle, of a fully paid-off 4-bedroom house that would then become another property in his development portfolio, likely staged and flipped through the same business Vanessa ran, at a profit that would have had nothing to do with family and everything to do with the numbers. Roland had been running in his head, since that first barbecue conversation, about keeping it in the family. I declined the offer, not because the money wasn't fair, but because I finally understood that my house had never been the actual target. My compliance had been the target, and I no longer intended to supply it. Derek came to see me alone, without Vanessa, about 2 weeks after the notice to vacate was filed, and this was the conversation that mattered more than any legal document, because it was the first time in 3 years my son spoke to me without an audience. He looked, for the first time since the baby was born, genuinely afraid, and not of losing the house, but of what he had allowed himself to become. He told me Roland had been the one who suggested the entire living arrangement from the start, using Derek's genuine concern for his mother's health as the emotional cover for what was, underneath, a financial strategy. He told me Vanessa's staging business was in serious debt, propped up entirely by Roland's referrals, and that losing access to our house, which they had been using as a staging showroom for prospective clients without ever telling us, would likely end the business within months. He told me, and this is the part that still moves me when I think of it, that he had not read the residency letter I asked him to sign because some part of him had not wanted to know what it said, because knowing would have forced him to admit what he was doing to his own parents. I did not forgive him in that conversation, because forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not something you hand over the moment someone finally tells the truth. But I did tell him something Marcus had taught me weeks earlier, that the trust Evelyn and I had established did not disinherit him. It restructured his inheritance around dignity, mine and Evelyn's, rather than around convenience, his and Roland's, and that path back into our lives, and eventually into that house, remained open to him, on those terms whenever he was ready to walk it honestly. The eviction was completed legally on a Friday morning in late October, and I will tell you plainly that I felt no triumph watching a moving truck take Derek and Vanessa's furniture out of the house I had built my life in, because triumph is what you feel over an enemy. And despite everything, I did not think of my son as an enemy. I thought of him as a man who had been slowly convinced, by someone with more confidence than character, that love and leverage were the same thing. Roland Ashford's business, I later learned through channels I will not detail here, except to say that Marcus had colleagues in commercial real estate law, was already facing scrutiny from 2 other families in the county, who had entered similarly informal family living arrangements that ended in disputed ownership claims, and my formal, documented refusal to be quietly maneuvered out of my own home became, according to Marcus, part of a pattern attorneys in that county were beginning to notice and discuss. I did not set out to be anyone's cautionary tale. I only set out to keep my receipts. Evelyn and I moved back into our house in November, into rooms that still smelled faintly of someone else's home staging candles. And I will tell you that the first night we slept in our own bed again, Evelyn cried, not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief, the particular relief of a person who has spent months being told she was a burden and finally remembers that she is simply home. Her heart, against the odds and against Roland Ashford's casual prediction that stress would be the end of her, stabilized that winter, not because of any miracle, but because peace, it turns out, is a form of medicine that no cardiologist can prescribe but every patient benefits from. Derek called every week that winter, tentative, honest calls that were nothing like the confident, rehearsed talking points he had delivered on our porch in September. He and Vanessa separated in the spring, not because of the house, he told me, but because once the financial pressure from her father's business lifted, they discovered they had very little left holding them together that wasn't tied to Roland's ambitions. He moved into a small apartment near his marketing job, took Tyler on weekends, and began, slowly, the work of becoming a man his own son could someday be proud of, rather than a man who had once told his sick mother to make room. I did not gloat, and I did not remind him of what he'd said on that porch, though I will admit I have thought of it often since. What I did instead was invite him to Sunday dinner, the same tradition where all of this had started 3 years earlier, and when he walked through the door of the house he had once told me wasn't mine anymore. He stood in the entryway for a long moment, looking at the hallway where I had taught him to ride his bicycle, and he said quietly, "I forgot this was ever just a home." I told him that was in the end the entire problem and the entire solution contained in a single sentence. It has been 8 months since that Sunday dinner. Tyler visits most weekends now, and Evelyn, who insists on being called Nana rather than grandmother, sits with him in the reading room that is, once again, entirely hers, teaching him the names of the birds that come to the feeder outside her window. Derek is rebuilding, slowly, the kind of man who reads documents before he signs them and asks questions before he accepts convenient answers, and Marcus tells me the trust we established will likely never need to be enforced strictly, because Derek has begun showing up consistently in the small daily ways that matter more than any grand gesture ever could. Roland Ashford's development firm, I understand, is facing a formal inquiry from the State Real Estate Commission regarding several of these informal family arrangements, though I take no particular satisfaction in it beyond the quiet confirmation that patience and documentation eventually outlast confidence and manipulation every single time. What I have learned at 68 years old, sitting in the house I built my life in, is that the people who try to take what is yours rarely do it with violence or theft in the way we're taught to fear. They do it with paperwork you don't read closely, with kindness that has strings attached, with the quiet, reasonable-sounding suggestion that you make room for someone else's family, as if you had ever stopped being family yourself. I did not win by fighting my son. I won by refusing to disappear quietly, by keeping every receipt, by trusting a good lawyer, and by remembering, through every cold night in that hotel, that the deed to that house, and to the life Evelyn and I had built inside it, had my name on it the entire time, whether or not anyone standing on that porch in the rain understood what that meant.